Right, there we go. Brilliant.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bhavna. So, like I say, I work in clinical trials and I have done for the last 25 years. I am in no way any sort of expert in Stargardt's disease whatsoever, and I'm also not a doctor, so I won't be able to advise anyone on particular trials that are going on. But what I aim to do today was to talk about the clinical trials process, how we got to where we are today, some of the reasons behind why we do some of the things we do. Sometimes the clinical trials process can be frustrating and there can be decisions made that seem confusing. So I just want to talk a little bit about the design and why that might be. And also talk about the guardrails that are there to keep you safe. Because I think that's really important that people understand that there are measures in there to keep you safe and to keep clinical trials safe as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of clinical trials, and there's a reference at the bottom of here. If anyone is geeky like me, feel free to go in and read that reference because it's got some fascinating things I never knew about any of some of these things. But clinical trials have been going on for thousands of years. And the first recorded one was in 562 BC. It was, and it's talked about in the Bible. Basically, this big, powerful king decided that he thought that everyone should only be allowed to eat meat and drink wine. Um, and there were some quite important people with royal blood who said, "Oh, we kind of want to eat some vegetables." And he said, "Okay, for 10 days, I will allow you to eat vegetables and drink water and see what happens." And at the end of the 10 days, those people looked the most well nourished. And because of that, the king said, "All right, you can carry on and eating vegetables." So I suppose that's the first kind of nutritional advice that we got and fed into the way that we eat today. So people have been comparing different groups of people for a long time, and now it's become a little bit formalized. James Lind in 1747, he was a doctor on a boat in the Royal Navy. He did a literature search, which is the first recorded literature search, to look at what people had done before to try and stop scurvy, because he was really distressed by the state of some of his sailors. And after reading that, he decided he was going to give some sailors with scurvy oranges and lemons, some seawater, some vinegar, and actually some cider as well, and see how they got along. And after a week, the sailors that had oranges and lemons were all better and working again. And that was, again, another bit of nutritional advice that we've carried on to this day. One thing to note is that it took 50 years before the Royal Navy gave lemon juice to every sailor. And that's because oranges and lemons were really expensive. And I think that's a really good parallel to the situation we're in today. Um, Showing that your treatment works is kind of the first step of getting patients to have it. Then there are a whole load of logistical things that have to come in, including budgets that are included in making sure that patients actually do get it. And then we move into modern times when they first used a double blind control trial. So, what that means is that the doctor that does the trial doesn't know what you're on, the patient doesn't know what they're on, the people that work in the offices filling in the forms doesn't know which patient is on what. Um, and the first recorded trial of that was 1943. It was for the common cold. Um, Patients don't work as well in the common cold, and during the war, they wanted all the workers working as hard as possible. It didn't work. And then in 1945, the first randomized curative trial, it was in tuberculosis for an antibiotic. And this is the first time that they used a statistical method to show, to decide which patient was getting what rather than just putting it out of the hat. So they used the statistics and things that I don't even understand to decide who got what as well. So these are all examples of clinical trials. They're very, very much similar to how we work today. The very basics of a clinical trial is you will have what two or more groups of people that you will make as standardized as possible. You will treat them in different ways. And in the modern way, it should be the intervention that you're trying to show versus the next best thing. So if there is an approved drug, then the comparator arm should be that approved drug. If there's no approved drug, then it will be a placebo. And so the traces is you get these two groups of people, the two different interventions. And at the end of it, you then look at who it is who got what and how they're faring now and how they're doing. And you use the evidence to show whether we should be treating more people with it. But there is an ethical and regulatory framework behind that. And I'm going to go and talk a little bit about the Declaration of Helsinki after this. And those are the guardrails that have been put in place and the guiding principles that any doctor that works with you should be following. And by law, they should be following. Um, People haven't always done the right things. During World War II, the Nazis did some horrendous things in the name of science because they treated some people lesser than other people. And I think, again, that's another lesson that we still need to be mindful of today. People absolutely need to be treated as equally. But because of that, the Nuremberg Code came out, which meant from 1947, if you were asked to take in a clinical trial, you had to give voluntary consent. And voluntary consent means you know about what's going to happen. And also, if you say no, that doesn't impact how you're treated in the future. And then there were a number of different incidences where those rules were strengthened. And in 1964 was the first version of the Declaration of Helsinki. It is a worldwide guideline of principles. Every single clinical trial in the world has to follow it, and it is enshrined by different laws in different countries. But I think it's one of the very few things where the whole world has a set of rules which they absolutely must follow. And I'm just going to read out the Declaration of Helsinki guiding principles because I think they're really important and I want to make sure that you're aware of all of them. If you're ever in a situation around a clinical trial and you don't think these are following, this is a huge red flag for me. And you should be reaching out to other people to see if this is all right. But if you don't know what your rights are, then you can't measure yourself against them. So, the guiding principles are that the health and well-being of a patient will be the first consideration of the doctor that is treating them. It's the duty of physicians to promote and safeguard health, well-being, and rights of patients, including those in medical research. Medical progress is based on research that ultimately must include participants. So without clinical trials and patients taking part, we can never move forward in our understanding of the disease or on how to treat it. Medical research involving human participants is subject to ethical standards that promote and ensure respect for all participants and protect their health and rights. Research must be well designed to balance risk and benefit. The primary purpose of medical research, including human participants, is to generate knowledge to understand the causes, the development and effects of the disease, improve preventative diagnostic and therapeutic inventions, and ultimately advance individual and public health. The purposes can never take precedence over the rights and the interests of the individual research participants. Those that run clinical trials research should be qualified to do so. So there should be a doctor involved in the vast majority of cases. And it will be reviewed by a regulatory authority and an ethics board, and their approval is absolutely needed before you can start. Your voluntary consent is essential. Provision should be made for you to continue treatment if it's safe and beneficial when the trial ends. Appropriate compensation and treatment for participants who are harmed as a result of participating in medical research must be ensured. Placebo will only be used if absolutely necessary, and patient privacy should be respected. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to just go back and just expand a little bit on from there. I mean, I think one of the really key things, and you'll hear me talking about it further in the talk, is the balance of risk and benefit is absolutely key to everything that happens within a clinical trial. There is risk in absolutely everything that we do. So if you go out and decide to cross the road, you're taking a risk by doing so. But there's a benefit to it. You want something that's on the side of the other side of the road, so you will do it anyway. There are things that you can do to mitigate that risk. So you can follow what, for people my age who are in the UK, would consider the Green Cross Code. You would think about the safety of the situation you're in. You'd be aware of your surroundings around you. You might use a crossing or a traffic light as the place that you cross. And so that's something that you can do to make it safer, but you can never 100% assume that someone's not going to come speeding down the road at 100 miles an hour. But you balance that risk and you do that risk assessment in your head. And that's really what people who run clinical research and the people who regulate that clinical research really have to establish, that the risk that you're asking patients to take is balanced by the benefits to them and to the population at large. And that's one of the things that the regulatory authorities will review. So every clinical trial they go will be approved by a regulatory authority and an ethics board. A regulatory authority will look at that risk benefit, will make sure the things that it's measuring are meaningful, and will look at all the data that has been collected beforehand and make sure that that means that there is a good chance of it being safe in a patient population and a good chance of it being effective as well. Without those things and without evidence to prove that ahead, the trial wouldn't be able to go ahead. Ethics boards, they are more local generally. They look at the ethics of running it, the population, and whether the information that's been given to the population is appropriate and clear. They will make sure that the doctors and the staff that are running it are appropriately qualified and they have all the facilities that they need to do so. I'm trying to think if there's anything else on there that I wanted to. Again, voluntary consent is absolutely 100% essential, and you should be given time to make consent. So you should be given information, and then you should be given time to take that in and make a decision. Provision to continue treatment if safe and beneficial when the trial ends. So I'm going to talk about phases a little bit later on. If you are a patient on a very big, large phase 3 end of the process trial, and the drug is shown to be safe and shown to work, then there should be provision for you to carry on taking that after the trial ends until you get approval. So you shouldn't just come to the end of the trial and stop taking it. There should be a way of you carrying on to get that. If you are in a slightly earlier trial where there's fewer patients and perhaps the sponsor of the trial doesn't have enough information to say that the drug is safe to take for a prolonged period of time, then you may not get that as a benefit at the end of the study. It's something that we always encourage sponsors to get as much data as they can and to continue along for as long as they can after the clinical trial, but it's not something that 100% always happens in early trials. But if everyone is sure that this is working, then you should carry on getting access. And it's something to ask about if you're ever asked about a clinical trial. What will happen at the end? If the trial doesn't work or is unsafe, then it will be stopped and your provision of drug will be stopped. Even if you personally think that it's had a benefit for you, if the data shows that it doesn't, then you won't have access to it anymore. And then appropriate compensation, that means that there will be insurance to make sure that you are taken care of if anything should happen. And another thing to note is that you shouldn't be paying to take part in clinical trials. All your medical care should be given for free. You should be given money to help travel to the clinical trial site. If you're there all day, you should be given lunch for free. It should be completely free to take part in a clinical trial. Sometimes you will even be compensated for the amount of time that you have spent doing it. The only time where I have seen people asked to be paid for a clinical trial is perhaps if they have found a clinical trial in another country and they really want to take part, and the sponsor and the investigator have said you can, but they don't have funds for you to travel between the countries. And in that case, I've seen patients pay for their own travel from one country to another, but everything that happens as part of the clinical trial and all their medical care is free once they are there. Having said that, in rare diseases, I've seen sponsors fund that kind of activity as well. So it's not given that it won't be happening, but that's the only time. Patient privacy should be absolutely respected. So your doctor will know everything about you and he will write that in your medical notes. There will be a representative from the drug company that comes and looks at your notes. And what they do is they compare what's in the notes to what should have happened to make sure the right things should have happened. And they will compare your notes to what has gone into the official database to make sure they match each other. So those people will know everything about you. But then once from then on, people only see what is in the database, and there's nothing in that database that identifies you as a person. There's a code put against your name, and so someone who's very closely related to you should be able to look at the data that's in the database about you and not be able to identify that it's you. So there won't be a date of birth in there. There won't be a name. So in ICH GCP, which is the rules that govern us, there are different responsible parties, and I just wanted to talk quickly about two of those. The first is the sponsor, and that can be a company, charity, a research authority. Sometimes it is a doctor if it's a very small trial. There is one sponsor by trial. They fund the study, they design the protocol, they ensure the correct approvals are in place. They ensure that the investigators or the doctors that do the study are appropriately qualified. They make sure those investigators are trained and have all the equipment that they need to run the trial. If they don't have it on site, they have to provide it. And they conduct the oversight of the investigator and make sure the data is clean. And that's the process that I was just talking about. And at the end, they do the analysis. So they unblind the data, they put it together, and then they have to report the data. And they have to report the data regardless of whether it's positive or negative. And an investigator may be one per study, but may be many. So I've seen some that are like 300 investigators for one study. And that's the doctor that you see. He decides if you're eligible. He consents you. He provides you the medication and measures the outcomes. He knows you personally and he has responsibility for your medical care. And as we said before, your medical care should be his prime responsibility. That should be the thing that overrules everything else. And he records data and then he reports it back to the sponsor. A little bit about the trial protocol, because I've referred to it, so I should say what it is. A trial protocol, it can be like 300 pages long, and it is a book that basically says exactly what is going to happen in the trial. So it will say how many different groups are you going to be comparing? Is the trial going to be blinded? Is everyone not going to know what it is? Or is it going to be open label? Is it going to be one where everybody knows what everybody's got? How many people will be recruited to each one of them? The eligibility criteria, so who can take part, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. What the treatments are that are being compared, why we think that those treatments are good options for these patients, and what evidence there is that those are the right ones to use. What tests will take part in the trial, and when they should have them, and details about what and how the information will be collected. So this is the rule book of the whole clinical trial, and your investigator will have a copy of this. The regulatory authorities and the ethics boards will have seen it, and that is what they have approved. So by law, because that is what is approved, that's what the investigator has to do. They're not supposed to deviate from that at all. And that's to ensure patient safety, but it's also there to make sure that risk benefit is still remaining the same. So the regulatory authorities have looked at all the evidence and they've weighed up the advantages of the trial and they've decided it's worthwhile. If you deviate from that protocol, you're changing that risk benefit. That by, I don't know, including a patient who perhaps isn't as safe or not monitoring as often as you said you were going to, that makes it more risky. So that's the reason why your doctor that you see will actually have very little control about what is done as part of the trial. What is done outside of your care as part of the trial, he'll have much more. And like we say, your medical well-being is his primary responsibility. So if he feels that what has to happen as part of the trial is not what's best for you, then it's within his power totally to say, we're going to stop this and we're going to go and do something different. So phases of clinical development, and it's a huge table with lots of information on. But one clinical trial is not enough to be able to say that a drug is good enough to be sold to the general population. There are a number of stages that you have to go through. You have phase one trials, which are typically very small. They're usually in completely healthy subjects. So these people are healthy subjects. They're paid to take part in these trials. Um, a typical design is that you will give the drug to 3 people and 3 people placebo, and then you will see what happens. And if that's fine, then you will maybe up the dose a bit and do that again and see what happens. So these are the trials where it's first in human, and really the objectives of these are to look if it's safe to give to humans. And these trials are done in incredibly controlled environments. And also what happens to that drug. So do you wear out? How long does it stay in your body? What dose level are there in your blood? And what impact does that have on your vital signs on and how you are? So they're incredibly controlled, small studies that are looking to make sure that it's safe to go in a wider population. They're usually in healthy subjects. If it's gene therapy, which makes a permanent change to your body, it's not ethical to do this in healthy subjects. So phase one studies are generally done in patients as well, if it's a gene therapy, for example. Then you go to a slightly bigger population for a phase two. And this, you're targeting patients only with the disease. And you're looking at sort of whether it continues to be safe in the patient population, whether the dose range that you have, so you may have different doses in a phase two, whether they work the same and are equally as safe, and how well the drug works. So POC, there is a proof of concept. Does this work in a small number of patients? Does it improve what you're trying to improve? Most drug trials fail at phase two. There's a huge number of them won't work in phase two and won't move any further forward, because this is the first time that you're really seeing whether it works in that patient population or not. Then you go to, if you do well in your phase two, then you move to your phase three, and you may have several different phase threes depending on what populations you're looking at. But your phase three is called a pivotal trial. So this is the trial that will decide whether you can go and have approval or not. You're looking at much larger patient numbers. We've got 300 to 3,000 is quoted on the slide. In a really rare disease, it might be much smaller. If you remember, during COVID, you had 50,000 people in these trials. So it could be hugely bigger. It depends on what you're trying to measure. The length of the study is much longer. It can go for years. And really, this is the trial to make sure that it continues to be safe. There aren't serious, rare adverse events that you only see when you treat a large number of people, and that it works on a wider range of people, and it continues to work over that time. And if you have a positive result after your phase threes, that's generally when you go and try and get approval. But you carry on in phase four, where you continue to monitor people that are using it in real world situations, and measure the safety and effectiveness. A little bit about endpoints, because they're really important, and they're really important to that risk benefit. An endpoint is the thing that you measure to see that you're trying to prove. So it's the thing that you're trying to prove is getting better by giving a medicine in most cases. It's also safety as an endpoint, but there's usually a different endpoint or a selection of different endpoints that measures how well you are from a disease point of view. So for Stargardt's, for example, that might be visual acuity or size of lesion, but that's the thing that you're trying to measure between the two groups to show that what you're doing has a positive effect. One thing to measure, this is a place where a patient community can really have an impact. You can work with, as a community, you can lobby drug companies and regulators, because it's really important that the endpoints that clinical trials are measuring are meaningful to you. If it's not a meaningful endpoint to a patient community, but it improves, it doesn't mean anything to you. It's why would you take a drug to, I don't know, make your skin better when you want to improve your sight? So it's really important, because I've seen clinical trials fail not because they don't work, but because they're not measuring the right thing. And the other thing to say about endpoints is they must be measured the same in every single site. So we said we can have thousands of sites on one particular trial, and it must be something that they can measure the same between those sites. So if your vision is being measured in one doctor's, you should be able to go to another one of those doctors, and if they did the same test, they would get the same results. So we can't. So things have to be validated. Sites have to be trained between them to make sure that they're comparable. Sometimes surrogate measures are used. So, for example of that is you might use cholesterol in a cardiovascular study. You might you measure the cholesterol levels and see how they're impacted in the shorter term, and so that you don't have to wait for people to have cardiac events to measure how well it works as well. So um, that's the thing. So endpoints can be really important, and that's why you're asked to come back and go to your particular doctor do it who has been trained on the protocol because he's been trained to do it a particular way that matches everywhere else. Inclusion exclusion criteria can be really important as well. They're the definition of who can take part in a clinical trial. In order for a clinical trial to work, you need the population to be similar enough that they're comparable to each other. You also need to think about whether this particular patient population is going to shine your drug in the best light. So in Stargardt, for example, what we've seen is that the clinical trials have been taking place at people who are quite early into their disease. So they're fairly newly diagnosed. And the reason for that is because those are the patients that are showing the most standard and quickest level of progression. So if your drug stops progression and you measure it in some people who have only just got their disease and are progressing quite fast compared to people who've had the disease for years and their progression is much slower, those two groups aren't comparable. So you might find that your drug doesn't show the benefit because your two groups are not, it's not like apples to apples. Also, if you just measured people who were much later in the disease and their progression was really slow, you would have to run that trial for much longer in order to show that there was a benefit. And if your trial takes longer, not only does it cost more money, but it slows down getting that drug to the patient community as well. So the inclusion exclusion criteria are really important. And I know that sometimes in some populations I've worked with, they can be a bit controversial because it feels like some patients are being benefited over other ones, or some patients, all the research is happening in them and none is happening to these people over there. But there is a reason behind why those people are picked. They also will pick patients who are less likely to get ill, but if they've got other diseases going, they may be excluded. And the reason for that is because it's a safety thing and it builds into that risk benefit assessment. And the last thing to say about inclusion exclusion criteria is that the doctor that you see has no control over them. He's been given the protocol that defines exactly the patient that's allowed to go in the protocol. He can't put you in. If you don't exactly fit that list of criteria, he legally can't put you in because if he puts you in, he's impacting that risk benefit assessment that we've talked about that has been legally approved. So it's really hard, I think, when you have been screened for a protocol and then you don't find the exclusion criteria, but there's nothing your doctor can do about it. If he put you in that trial, the person from the drug company would come, spot that, and then they would withdraw you from the trial again. If the drug company didn't withdraw you after the trial had been finished, the regulatory authorities would come inspect it, would find that that's what happened, and the potential is that it would completely negate the whole clinical trial and they would have to repeat the whole thing again. So that they're really strict, and I think that's sometimes really hard, but there is a reason for that. Right, I'm nearly finished, I promise. So the what happens when you take part, you're consented, you should be given information, you should be given an opportunity to ask questions, you should be given some time to think about it. You are screened, so you have a number of tests to see whether you meet those inclusion exclusion criteria. You're given the intervention, so you're then randomized into one of groups. Nobody knows whose group that is most of the time. and you're given that intervention, which you will take according to the protocol once a day, once a week, whatever it might be. And then you're asked to come back to the trial to measure the endpoints, which are those endpoints that show how well the drug's working and whether it is safe again. So you will have to come to the doctor more often than you normally would. And that's one of the annoying things about a clinical trial, because you have to go to the doctors more often. But the reason for that is it's that risk benefit assessment, making sure you're being monitored frequently to see if there's been any change in case there's something untoward happening. Then the trial will come to an end. There will be some follow-up. So in a traditional drug, that's normally about a month. It depends on that data they've collected earlier on how quickly it exits your body, just to make sure there aren't any safety things that happen after you've stopped taking it. If it's a gene therapy, that follow-up will go on for at least 5 years to look for delayed adverse events. In some therapies, it's up to 15, but I don't think there's anything in Stargardt's that's that long at the moment. And then the drug company will take it out and will see who was in what group, will do the analysis, see if one group did better than another group, and then they will report that out. And they will report that out to the authorities and in scientific papers. But they should also be reporting out to the patients so you can see what you have contributed to. And if you're not going that, I think, Bhavna, that's something that Stargardt's Connected should be pressurizing the drug companies to provide to the patients that have taken part. So, Stargardt, how can you find out more about clinical trials that are being run at the moment? Stargardt's Connected website has a page on that. Above them, we've been talking about that being updated in the next few days. There were the recent conference with Stargardt's Connected. There were a whole load of presentations from the different drug companies, and they're available on the Stargardt's Connected YouTube channel, so you can look at those. Every clinical trial that ever happens has to go onto clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website that lists out all the ongoing studies, the eligibility, the study design, the location of sites. I did a check on the 12th of February. There were 16 ongoing at that point. Some of them were interventional, some of them were not, some of them were just natural history studies. So you can look at that. When Bhavna and I have been talking about this, we're not quite sure how well that's monitored and how well it's validated. And there's been talk about some Retina Association, I think, saw some clinical trials on there where people were being charged to take part. That absolutely shouldn't be happening. And if you see a clinical trial that you're interested in that's on clinicaltrials.gov, but it's not listed on the Stargardt's Connected website, then you should feel free to reach out to Bhavna so that we can check it out and talk to our medical advisor about whether that's a good idea. And that's it. I feel like I've really rushed through it really quickly, but I tried to get as much as I possibly could. So are there any questions?
Louise, this is Kirsten here. I've got a question